Welcome to Real Talk with Sarah. I'm your host, Sarah Roberts, and tonight we're tackling a topic that affects millions of us, and yet it's rarely discussed. We're talking about incontinence. I wanted to shine a light on this topic as a way to remind those suffering that they're not alone, as well as to remind us all to have greater compassion for others, as we don't often know what a person is living with. This show is also meant to provide some hope for the future as we explore new treatments and research. Luckily, I've got some incredible experts to help us understand the issue better. First, we'll hear from Derick Fage, ambassador for the Canadian Continence Foundation, as he shares his personal experience. And later, I'll have Harley, CEO of Nurses Specialized in Wound, Ostomy, and Continence Canada, who will share the latest statistics and research. And finally, we'll hear from Pomeroy, a pelvic floor physiotherapist who will teach us ways to strengthen our pelvic floor. It's a big show, so let's get started. Episode 25 of Real Talk with Sarah starts right now. Well, if you live in Ottawa, then my first guest likely needs no introduction. He's a powerful speaker, a community leader, and the ambassador for the Canadian Continence Foundation. He has an amazing story to share, and I'm thrilled to welcome a man I am proud to call my friend, Derick Fage. Welcome, Derick.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
It's kind of like old home week, right?
I know. It's great. This is where my career started, right here in this room.
I know. So I want to talk about what you're doing now with the Canadian Continence Foundation a little bit later.
Okay.
But let's just kind of go back to where it all began, sharing your story from wherever you want to start the story.
Well, I think the best place to start is at birth. I was born with what's called an imperforate anus. There are different types of them. I was born with a high imperforate anus.
So a high imperforate anus.
Correct.
Tell us what that means.
Well, that means I was born, first of all, without the actual anal opening. So they had to create that opening at birth. They had to do what they call a pull-through, and people can look that up at home. There's a lot of details when that's concerned. I was also born without a sphincter muscle. So, with that meant that I would have a hard time with dealing with incontinence, probably for the rest of my life. I mean, there's a lot of things that have happened in the last 50 years for sure. But that
like
was more
as far as advancements.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, back then I had a colostomy for the first I believe it was 8 months. So that's just they make an incision in your stomach. They bring out your intestine, and they sort of cut the intestine in half, put a tube over it, and so you go into a bag.
Now, why would they have needed to do that if they had created the opening for you?
Well, because it had to heal, right? So that's a pretty major surgery to have done at birth. So during that healing process, I had the colostomy, and then once the healing process was done and they were happy with the results of it, then they removed the colostomy at that point. I mean, that for me, when you're a baby, you don't remember any of those things. So, for the first probably 3 or 4 years, for the most part, it was my parents who had to deal with it, and it was a shock to them, right? I mean, you can imagine 50 years ago, your baby's born, and they say, hey, by the way, there's a complication. He has a medical condition, which they say is about between 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 6,000 will be born with this type of condition.
1 in 5,000 to 1 in 6,000 people. And I know that seems like one in very few, it's not a huge number, but it kind of is.
It is, yeah.
And with, so many people living with this, that's why I wanted to talk to you today, because I think so many people are mired in shame because of what they're living with. And I just feel like you have taken this experience and your whole life, and you've used it for such good. So again, I want to talk more about all the things that you're doing with your story a little later. But let's talk about, so you are a very sick child.
Yeah.
You're now, you're a toddler, I'm assuming, and again, you're in diapers. You don't know that you're not supposed to. You are supposed to be wearing diapers. And so talk to us about when you first started going to school, and when you started knowing that you had this condition and that other kids didn't?
Yeah, probably grade 1. Once I got into grade 1, most kids were out of diapers. I wore diapers till about the age of 13. My parents had to sort of sit down with school administration, explain the medical condition. So I had, I had a few things that were available to me. I had the key to the staff washroom so that I could actually change in private, to have to do that in a public washroom in school where you have to sort of change your diaper and so forth. It could have caused even more problems, right? And the staff were great, you know, and I didn't have to put up my hand to go to the washroom, that kind of thing. But yeah, you know, when I found out, you know, I've got my own key, none of the other kids, you know, have the privilege of not putting up their hand and that kind of thing, then I knew I was different than other kids. And, you know, with this condition, you have your accidents, and you know, they would be pretty bad. So in grade 1, you know, I think in kindergarten I probably had a couple, but you know, a lot of young kids are still in diapers themselves at that point. But in grade 1, when I started having accidents, other kids, and you know, just the smell and so forth, right? Because you know, I soiled myself on a constant basis. Now, you know, the management of that as a child is to go to the washroom as frequently as possible. So I sort of had my diapers in the staff washroom so I could go quite frequently during the day. But, you know, you sort of get caught up in schooling, right? And you're doing physical activity and that kind of thing. And accidents happen. And that's when the bullying began. And it was relentless. I mean, I was picked on relentlessly from grade 1 to about grade 7.
And so this would be accidents happening in the classroom when you couldn't get to the washroom quick enough.
Yeah, or in the schoolyard or you know, that sort of thing.
So I know you've shared with me before that because of, you know, people who are born with a sphincter muscle, we're able to hold our poop, right? We can hold it, and you don't have that luxury.
No, I mean, if I get sort of stomach cramps and so forth, which happens to a lot, and this is something I found out in sort of my research, and I was quite surprised, but a lot of people that have the condition also have a lot of stomach issues as well. So that combined with the no sphincter muscle, it makes it very, very difficult to have, you know, any bowel management whatsoever. So, you know, I had to stay away from certain foods. I was not very good with that, I'll be honest with you. You know, my parents didn't sort of push me into it necessarily. You know, I shouldn't be eating spicy foods and I shouldn't be eating sugar and that kind of thing. But you know what? Every other kid was doing it. I had a brother and sisters that were having ice cream or, you know, candy at Halloween, and I knew I would suffer the consequences, but I suffered the consequences regardless of it.
And
right?
I can imagine your parents were doing everything they could do to make you feel like a totally normal kid.
Yeah, and sometimes not the best decisions, right? Not the best decision making. Maybe they could have been tougher on me, but I'm kind of glad they weren't, because it helped me just feel a little more like I'm like everybody else, right? Because there were many points in my life where I didn't feel like the rest of the kids. At times, you know, I love nature. I was in nature constantly because, you know, nature, you could be out and, you know, if you crap yourself, no one knows, right? You know what I mean?
You can go in the woods.
I would play by. We had a beautiful house that backed onto a creek. I spent so many times in that creek just coming up with adventures in my head, and you know, spent a lot of time by myself there. But I felt comfortable. But I almost felt like an animal sometimes, right? That I was like this dirty animal compared to the other kids that I had to constantly clean myself. You know, I probably bathed and showered 3 times, 4 times more than any other, you know, children my age.
What did that do to you psychologically as a tween and a teen?
Well, it was interesting because I was a hyperactive kid. I had a lot of energy. My mom would always joke that, geez, you know, if they were diagnosing a kid for ADHD back 50 years ago or 40 years ago, like you would have been diagnosed with ADHD and probably put on maximum Ritalin sort of thing.
Thank goodness you weren't diagnosed.
Yeah, it's true, because my parents were great because they helped me find focus, but I was this hyperactive kid and I loved people, yet at the same time I wanted to be so distant from people.
Wow.
So it was this big conflict for me all the time. I was the class clown. I spoke out all the time. I think a lot of it to do too because I wanted to be popular. Because, you know, when you get picked on and you get bullied, the defense mechanism many times is, okay, well, maybe I'll make them laugh, or maybe I'll do something really ridiculous that even the teacher's probably going to give me heck for, but, you know, I'll get them on my side. So I had this conflict of, trying to impress all the time, but also isolating myself as much as possible. I almost like lived two different lives.
Absolutely, and you were never telling anybody.
No.
Right, like none of your
No.
classmates knew as far as you knew.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, they knew something was going on. I know that some of the parents, from the neighborhood had tried to explain it to their kids when they found out that I was being bullied. But kids can only understand so much, right? And I don't blame any of the kids. Unfortunately that's what happens. It becomes sort of a mob mentality, right? When something happens to a kid or a child has a challenge and somebody starts picking on them, everybody else kind of goes, oh, okay, now it's our chance to, get in on this as well, because you almost form an identity, for yourself.
Lord of the Flies, or like
Yeah.
strength in numbers, or groupthink.
Absolutely.
Like if we're all on
For sure.
this side.
And when I've spoken about this, especially to young people, I explain to them, it's interesting. I could barely remember any of the names of the bullies, but I could name you every single person that came to my aid in the schoolyard, even throughout life, everybody that supported me, all these. And, perfect example is, John Milkey, a friend of mine here. I'm sure you know John, a radio host here in Ottawa for many, many years. And after I came public, I went back to John and I thanked him for walking me to school those so many years ago. And that he was one of my heroes. And John was shocked. He was like, I just walked to school with you. And I said, yeah, you don't know how important that was. And it was just by chance. Like, John and I lived in the same neighborhood, and all of a sudden we'd meet at the corner, and I'd be like, oh, thank God, here's John. No one's going to pick on me on the way to school.
So you felt like
but John didn't know.
Right.
Like,
he was
John
like your
didn't
protector without knowing.
Without even knowing he was a protector. And the same thing, coming back from school as well. And John was, completely shocked, but also flattered. So I made sure I went back to some of those people and just said, hey, thanks a lot. Thanks for helping
so
me.
much, because it's like what Maya Angelou talks about, or one of her famous quotes. People don't remember what you said or what you did, but they remember how you made them feel.
Yeah.
And if we can all remember to have more compassion, because we just don't know what people are living with. People look at you, they think live TV, this guy that's got this career, that's doing all these amazing things, speaking in public, doing all of this. No one would ever think that you are living with this.
Yeah, it's an invisible disability, I guess you could say, right? And it takes a lot, and I understand why people isolate themselves. One of the messages I've been trying to spread is it's going to be difficult to have the conversation. It's going to be tough to tell your spouse, to tell your doctor, to tell your friends, to tell your colleagues, but it's crucial for your own mental health.
More with Derick after the break. Back in a moment. Welcome back to Real Talk with Sarah. We're talking about incontinence on this show, and I've got Derick Fage with me sharing his experience.
Don't change the channel. You just heard incontinence. I know it's scary, but don't be frightened.
It's all good, especially because you're showing us that we're not alone.
Yeah.
There are other people that are going through this or something else, and they can know that they're not alone. So we were talking in the break, your one regret is sort of not sharing it sooner, and I totally relate to that.
Yeah, I didn't want to shout it from the rooftops, obviously, for many, many reasons, embarrassment and shame and so forth. I joked so people ask me, did you ever regret it at one point when you finally shared it? And I said, the only regret I had, and I say it jokingly, but it's kind of true, is that, you're at a cocktail party and a dinner party and someone lets one go.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, now everyone will look at me and be like, that's the guy. Like, he's responsible, right? I mean, that's the one thing that came to mind. Oh, man, I'm going to be the guy. Everyone's going to come and walk over to me and let one go and go, yeah, continent guy, get to blame it on him, sort of thing, right? But in this very room is where I went public.
I know.
It was such a strange situation. So the executive director of the Canadian Continence Foundation, Jackie Cahill, is a guest on the show. And I meet her in the green room and we're just chatting away. And I say to Jackie just in passing, hey, by the way, I've suffered from, or I've been living with chronic fecal incontinence since birth. And she's like, what? but you're doing a live television show every day. What? Really? And I said, yeah. She asked me if I would share it on live television that day. And I just felt, you know what? I think it's time. Just spontaneously in that moment, I thought, yeah, you know what? I'll share it. And I did. And then I shared it on social media. I posted it on Facebook and on Twitter. And then I had this overwhelming response. It was amazing, and that's what I said, one of the regrets, that you just started was not saying it sooner. And I know it's embarrassing, and there's a lot of shame involved in it. Listen, I've gone through all of it, but if I could give any advice to anybody, because there's 400 million people estimated in the world that are living with urinary incontinence. We don't know about fecal incontinence, and unfortunately, sometimes we downplay urinary incontinence, like, oh, it's leakage, and it's normal as we get older, or it's normal for women after, pregnancy. It's not normal. And there are many resources out there. You've got a couple of guests coming up that'll tell you that there are so many resources and exercises and so forth that you can do. So it's not normal. But when you find out that those numbers, 400 million people,
and that's just urinary.
And then you don't feel alone anymore. You know what really bothers me is the fact that over all of those years seeing specialists, not one person in the medical field told me that there are other people like me.
Oh my gosh.
Not once. Did they say, hey, don't worry, Derick, you know what, that there are other people born with fecal incontinence? I think, sometimes, in practice, you're just trying to help out that person, right, in the physical moment. But the mental part of it, I think, is even more important. That's why I came out and went public more than anything, is just the detriment that it's had on me mentally. Physically, listen, I can handle it.
We can manage symptoms. We can handle the logistics of it, if you will. But that's so true. The emotional, mental, struggle that we go through.
I planned my own suicide. I was this close to taking my own life. I was lucky that I had, this was in my late teens, early 20s, and people are like, so what was the actual age? I don't remember, because I was abusing alcohol, I was abusing drugs, I was in a deep depressive state. I was always one of those people that, put on a happy face and pretended everything was great, and then realized that, I'm not just unhappy, I am depressed. And that day I smoked a lot of pot, I had been drinking a lot, I had planned my own suicide, and then I had an epiphany, and I thought, don't I owe it to all of the, you mentioned support group. I had an incredible support group. That's what's scary for me when I think about people out there that have isolated themselves and they don't have it. I had a huge support group, and I still planned my own suicide because I thought, no woman would find me attractive. I probably would never get married. This is the spot I had found myself in. And then I remembered all of those people. And my best friend Gary was, 2 doors down. And how is that going to affect their lives? That's what I thought. My mom's life, my dad's life, my extended family, my brother, my sisters. Gary, they find me dead the next day, and don't I owe it to them to be alive? As almost a thank you, right? You put in all that time and love and support, and then I would have taken it all away from them.
Oh my gosh.
That's what dawned on me. And going public, as I said, best thing I would give advice is tell everybody. I had people that reached out to me and said, I haven't even told my family doctor. I haven't told my spouse. I've been hiding it from my spouse. I haven't told any of my friends, my best friends. I haven't told my colleagues. All of those people will understand. You may listen, I've had in my career people talk behind my back and make fun of me and snicker and so forth. Let them do that. You know what? That's never going to stop. I agree. I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say that's not going to happen. But guess what? That's about 5% of the people you're going to meet where they're going to, maybe have a little fun with it and make fun of you behind your back. 95% of people will be there to support you, to love you, to make sure that you can live a better life. Because the more people that know, the better chance you have of living a better life, getting out and doing things.
Totally.
Right? Isolation is an epidemic. The Red Cross is calling it an epidemic. It said 10% of people in the world live in isolation. That is a sad number.
Now that's 10% of all people
Of all
who feel isolated for whatever reason.
That's right.
But it's so true, because I've shared this before, and I'm going to talk about it a bit later, that you sharing your story allowed me to share mine. You sharing your story made me think, oh my God, if Derick Fage can share that personal experience, I can certainly tell people that I battled addiction and I've gotten sober. I mean, it almost seemed like, come on. Like, if he can share this, it's unbelievable. And your compassion for others, I think, is what has come from your experience.
I'm grateful that I have the condition.
I was going to ask, if you could go back and change it.
I would never change it. It's helped me better connect with people. I think when you go through challenges like that, you understand other people's challenges. They can be completely different challenges, right? But you have an understanding. You have a spiritual connection to that person. When you sit across from somebody and they describe their own challenge to you, and I've done thousands of interviews, and you go, and they feel it, right? Because they go, wow, this person, they get it. They understand me. They care about me and about what I've gone through.
We're a human family.
Yes.
We are all the same. You're dealing with fecal incontinence. I deal with addiction. Like, we're all the same. We all have stuff that we're dealing with. And we all have shame at some point or another. And truly, speaking out about it is the way to push through that shame. That shame only lives in the dark. So tell us what you're doing to speak out about incontinence with the Canadian Incontinence Foundation.
So it was interesting, because Jackie, after she came on the show and I went public, she reached out to me literally 2 days later and said, listen, we have been looking for sort of a champion of the foundation, an ambassador for the foundation for years, especially a public figure. And, unfortunately, not many public figures want to share that kind of thing. And I didn't even consult with Monica. I didn't even call up Monica and say, hey, what do you think? They've offered me. I just said yes on the spot. And, it took a little while to get things rolling, but the mission has become sharing my story so that people know that they're not alone, so that people know that there are resources out there. CanadianContinence.ca, I mean, we have a ton of resources. Our executive director, Jackie, she just was in front of the World Health Organization talking about, absorbent products and how they should be free. I mean, I'm in a position where I can afford these products, but there's a lot of fantastic products out there, a lot of different brands, and they're great, but they're not cheap. And if you're in a position where you're in a social economic position where you can't afford that thing, those products, you're now choosing to eat and pay rent over buying an absorbent product that will allow you to get out of the house and stop being isolated and live a productive life. And, approaching governments always want to know, hey, what's the return on our investment if we make these free and we stop collecting taxes on them, or let's say we even give a break on them or whatever. Well, the return on investment is people get out of their house, they spend money in their community, their mental health is better, they're less likely to get in long-term care more quickly, because many people go into long-term care, unfortunately, simply because they can't manage their incontinence on their own, or they can't afford to do it on their own. I mean, if that's not a compelling argument for governments around the world, I don't know what is.
I don't know what it is either.
Right? So that's part of the message, the message of, resources are available, as I mentioned earlier, that there are resources. So, that foundation is set up so that you can reach out to them. And I'm telling you, Jackie will answer the call. The executive director of the foundation will talk to you one-on-one and help you find a way through it. There's so many things available now.
It's amazing. You did a TEDx talk called The Relentless Pursuit of Happiness. We've got only a minute left. How do you stay so happy?
Being grateful for everything that you have, right? I'm not going to pretend that I'm one that writes down everything I'm grateful for, but I recognize things that I'm grateful for, and I take moments during my day or during the week to recognize those things and to see how it has shaped me as a human being, as a person.
You're amazing, Derick Fage. You're an absolute inspiration to me and to so many.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. When I come back and pull myself together, I'll have Kathy Harley with me. Back in a moment. Welcome back to Real Talk with Sarah. If you're just joining us, we're talking about incontinence on this show. And I've got Kathy Harley, CEO of Nurses Specialized in Wound, Ostomy, and Continence Canada, to help us understand the scope of the issue. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you for involving us in this conversation. You know, this is a very difficult conversation for people to be able to have.
Yeah.
The word and the term incontinence, when we say it, what we're referring to is the involuntary release of urine and feces, and not in the right place and not in the right time.
Well, that's it. I don't mean to laugh, but it's exactly. It's, you know, we're fine if we're in the bathroom and these things are happening, but it's when we are, you know, playing with our children, when we're laughing, when, you know, we're in public. We don't want these things to happen.
Exactly. And what I find is that a lot of people who do have a problem with incontinence, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to have the crucial conversation because they're embarrassed. And I mean, research shows that people have feelings of embarrassment. They become socially isolated. They just don't want to tell anybody, and they need help. And there's places for them to get help. They don't need to be alone.
You know, that's my message. We're not alone. But that concept that they don't even find it, when I was researching for this show, trying to get statistics and numbers, you know, about who suffers with incontinence, it's really tough. Now, is that also because are people even reluctant to even tell their own doctor? Like, they're not telling their spouses and their friends, but are they not even telling their own doctor about this?
In many cases, they aren't telling their doctor, and they're living with it in silence. But they have to know they're not alone. And according to the Canadian Continence Foundation, there are 3.3 million Canadians who are living with urinary incontinence. And when we look at fecal incontinence, people aged 65 and lower, about 1% of the population is suffering with fecal incontinence. But when you go 65 and higher, it's up to 7%. And people who are living in nursing homes, it's even worse. At least 50% of people are living with an incontinence issue.
So what are the symptoms? So what are the causes of incontinence? I know that sometimes, you know, women have babies and then they just, you know, they think that, okay, this is just part of the after effect of having a child.
Yeah, so in order to understand the causes of incontinence, I'm just going to give you a snapshot of the urinary tract.
Yes.
So you have two kidneys, you have two tubes attached to them, which are called ureters. So what happens is the blood is filtered by the kidneys produce urine, the urine goes down through the ureters into the bladder. The bladder, think of a grapefruit. It's about the same shape and size of a grapefruit.
Okay.
And the bladder wall has many different layers, and it has a main muscle that contracts when the bladder is full, and it signals the release of the urine through into the urethra, and then the urine goes outside the body. So that main muscle of the bladder is very critical in the whole process of urinary elimination.
Okay.
The bladder can hold about 300 to 500 milliliters of fluid at any given time. And so as far as causes go, if you have a weakening of the pelvic floor, which is the area that holds the bladder, or a weakening of the urethral sphincter, which can be caused by chronic diseases such as multiple sclerosis. You can also have incontinence issues if you get a urinary tract infection, because the infection can actually impact that big muscle that releases the flow of urine into the urethra.
So would that be like a short-term experience with incontinence? Do some people have that? Or in that case, would that person then have, you know, suffer with incontinence forevermore afterwards?
If it's incontinence due to infection, the person can be treated with antibiotics, and the infection can be resolved, and then the incontinence issue should be resolved. But if people do have chronic diseases, they may end up needing other management plans in order to be able to rectify the situation. Yes.
So now, do you want to talk about fecal incontinence and how that happens?
Yeah. So fecal incontinence, I mean, it's a similar situation. When you look at the anatomy, there's a lot of muscles and sphincters that are involved. And if they're not working properly, it can cause the release of stool again at a time that is involuntary. And so that can also be a big problem for people.
When it comes to care, so I know we've got a few products here. What can people use, and what are sort of Band-Aid solutions versus what are more holistic, maybe sort of root cause fixes? What can we do?
Right. So I think the first step is for the person to feel comfortable to have the discussion with their primary healthcare provider. So they need to talk to their general practitioner or family physician or even a nurse practitioner who can help to guide them to the right management path. They may want to run some diagnostic tests on them, from a simple stress test where the person would cough or jump to see how much urine is coming out of their body, to a urinalysis to look for infection, or they may do more advanced testing where they're actually looking through the urinary tract with a lens, or they're doing ultrasound. So there are many tests that can be done. And after the testing is done, then the person could be referred to a nurse specialized in wound ostomy continence or a nurse continence advisor, so that a plan can be put together in order to help rectify their situation. So there is help out there, or they may end up being referred to a urologist or another specialist in order to get surgery if that is required. As far as the products go, there are many products out there that can help solve short-term solutions anyway to make life more livable. You will notice that we've come a long way with continence products. We have branded products, absorbent products for both men and women.
Yeah, because they'll fit differently for men versus for women.
They will. The anatomy is different, and we do need to make sure that we are getting the right product, the right size, and the right level of absorption. And these absorptive products come in all levels of absorption to meet everybody's needs. There are also other products. The one that you have in your hand there is, that's actually from Hollister. That's a fecal collector. So that can be cut to fit and applied to a patient that's incontinent of feces in order to collect the feces so that it doesn't get all over the bed and keeps it contained. There are other solutions and packaging. The one you have now is, yes, that's from Coloplast, and you can see that one is for men who need to have what's called intermittent self-catheterization. So they could have had an accident or trauma and they've lost the sensation and the muscle control of their bladder.
Okay.
And
maybe I won't open this whole package.
Yes,
but so this is for urinary incontinence for men.
For men, but it would be for men who are unable to void or to urinate on their own, and so they have a nicely packaged catheter system so that it's very discreet for the men. And then this is another one. This is from Hollister. This is for women who do intermittent self-catheterization. It's small enough to put in your purse, and you just open the top and you can pull the catheter out. It's very discreet, and then you have a place to put it when you're done. These are single-use catheters, and then very easy to use, very discreet for women's needs.
When it comes to urinary incontinence, is there any amount that is normal or okay, or as soon as we're laughing and a little bit comes out and we think, oh, is that like, what is kind of the allowable amount to not have to go to the doctor and start to look at alternatives?
Well, I think if you are exercising or running and you're finding that you are starting to have little dribbles or leaks of urine, and it's happening on a regular and consistent basis, I think it's the right time to seek medical help, to have the first conversation at least, so that plans can be put into place. It may be as getting pelvic floor exercises early on that can act as a preventative measure. And I think prevention is a big aspect of continence management.
I love that, prevention. And we're going to be talking with Jackie Pomeroy, who's going to come on and teach us some of those preventative measures to strengthen the pelvic floor. What is the big message that you like to share whenever you're speaking in groups and doing your work?
The message I like to share is that you can have the conversation, particularly with our nurses that are specialized in wound ostomy continence, with nurse continence advisors, with urology nurses, and with your GP and your nurse practitioner. they are all open to having that conversation with you. They're all trained, they're skilled in how to approach the situation, and they have diagnostic techniques, they have product solutions, they can create a plan. It's very important to prepare for these conversations, and one thing that you can do is keep a voiding log. So every time you urinate, write it down in a book and keep a log, or if you are having fecal incontinence, write it down so that you can talk to them about the time it happens, what you were doing when it happened, and then that will give them all the information that they need to help get the right plan of care together for you. So, my main message is it's time to have the conversation. We want to talk to you, and we want to do everything we can to make your life the best it can possibly be.
What a message. Thank you so much for being here, Kathy. I know you've helped a lot of people tonight. After the break, I'll have Jackie Pomeroy teaching us exercises to strengthen our pelvic floor. Back in a moment. If you're just joining us, we're talking about incontinence tonight, and I've got Jackie Pomeroy from Pelvic Support Physiotherapy with me to teach us ways we can strengthen our pelvic floor. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm really excited to be part of this program highlighting this important topic.
It really is an important topic that not enough people talk about because we're mired in shame. We think we're the only ones that are living with it. Let's start out with, knowing what you do as a physiotherapist. Can you define pelvic floor physiotherapy? I don't think a lot of people know what it is.
Exactly, Sarah. Pelvic floor physiotherapy involves the assessment and treatment of the pelvic floor muscles and also the structures that are related to that, so the joints and the connective tissue related to the bowel and bladder.
Okay. And so when it comes to dealing with people that are living with incontinence, what are some of the reasons for it?
Many times it's because the pelvic floor itself is either underactive or weak, or the pelvic floor can be overactive, as in too tight and non-relaxing. So both of these issues can cause problems with incontinence, and the treatment approach is different depending on the cause.
So when it comes to treatment options, when you have people that come in, so let's say it's a woman who's had a baby, what would be the treatment plan for someone like that?
For somebody who's recently had a baby, we'd usually have a referral, say, from the midwife or from their doctor, or a self-referral, and we would generally see people at their 6-week postpartum time, because that's the best time to start helping. And with any person, we'll take a detailed history. So we want to find out what the causes are behind the incontinence. If it's related more to a stress urinary incontinence, which is caused by an increase in intra-abdominal pressure, for instance, when you cough or sneeze or laugh, or if it's more related to perhaps urge incontinence, where there could be some bladder irritation that's happening. So we try to take a detailed history to find out about the person's voiding habits, their diet, their water intake, their occupation, habitual exercise first. And then we would look at the person, we do a complete examination of the pelvic floor, but we also look at your posture and your breathing habits and the way you move as well.
Why posture?
So the pelvic floor muscles, they work ideally in certain positions that are more favorable towards a neutral spine position.
And it makes me think, like everything, right?
Yes,
like that's
a good
our
posture allows us to, it facilitates correct use of muscles. So when we go into our exercises a little bit later, I'll show you how to sit in the correct posture, and we'll have some suggestions for people to be able to access that.
And you mentioned voiding habits.
Yes.
What do you mean?
So voiding habits, as Kathy mentioned, is keeping track of how many times you go to the bathroom, say for emptying your bladder. The normal number of times to go to the bathroom per day is 5 to 8 times per day. Many people don't have any idea of how often they're going, and sometimes it's easier to think of it in terms of time. So we'll ask, do you go to the bathroom every couple of hours? And they'll say, no, it's more like every half an hour, and sometimes every 15 minutes if I'm getting ready for work and I'm feeling nervous and I keep emptying my bladder. So we want to train the bladder to be able to hold a larger volume of urine so that you're not constantly having to go to the bathroom.
So it's not, so what about people, I'm going to say I'm kind of like this, where in the morning I drink a lot of things.
Yes.
I have a big glass of lemon water first thing, and then I drink a smoothie typically as my breakfast, and then I have a cup of decaf coffee, and I find that I'm going a fair bit at that first part of the day, and then I love to drink a lot of water throughout the day. I find I'm the kind of person, wherever I am, if I can go to the bathroom and just get rid of whatever's there, I feel like that's a good approach to then not having to be desperate. Is it better for us to hold on to it a little longer?
It's better to not go just in case. Lots of people go because they could go, they see the bathrooms there and they think, oh, I'll just go to the bathroom.
Yes, this is me, yes.
But you're actually training your bladder to hold smaller volumes of urine.
Okay.
So you want to find a healthy balance between going frequently enough. We don't encourage people to hold their bladder for, say, 4 hours at a time, because that's overextending the bladder contents. So it's getting that right balance of going between every 2 to 3 hours during the day, and perhaps once at nighttime.
So 5 and 8 times a day is sort of the sweet spot.
That's correct.
Okay,
yes,
so tracking it is so important, because it's so true. How many times did I go to the bathroom? I mean, who knows this? Nobody remembers.
And often there are quite a few bladder irritants in our diet as well. So for instance, you mentioned caffeine. Decaf coffee can be a good alternative. Smoking and alcohol are bladder irritants.
Smoking?
A lot of people don't realize that, so very irritating to the bladder.
Meaning stimulating, making you feel like you... Interesting.
Yes.
Why
yes,
is that?
Yes. This is decreased circulation and because of the chemicals.
One more reason to kick smoking.
Exactly. Yes.
I know it's hard. I'm an ex-smoker myself. I understand it, but another reason to do that.
To stop. Other bladder irritants are carbonated drinks, and not just pop, but actually carbonated water, which is very popular, of course. So the most bladder-friendly fluid that you can have is still water. And drinking about 6 to 8 glasses or 1 to 2 liters per day, but don't overdo it with your water intake either. You can actually have too much water, and that will make you have more urinary frequency.
And is this for everybody? Or is this for people who are struggling with incontinence, that water? Because I'm often encouraging people to drink lots of water throughout the day. Is this just for people that are kind of dealing with it, or for all of us?
It's really it depends on how much you exercise, how much you perspire as well,
right,
and how much other fluids you're getting in your diet. Because diet also has a huge impact on both fecal and urinary incontinence, especially when it comes to the issue of constipation, which is a really another hidden issue in society, in that people don't realize that they're constipated because perhaps they have a bowel movement every 1 or 2 days, but they're having such a difficult time with that bowel movement that they're causing all kinds of strain and damage to their pelvic floor in the process. Wow. So a high fiber diet is very important, at least 25 grams per day along with water, and there's many great sources of high fiber such as whole grain cereals, beans, fruits and vegetables like squash, just coming into season now. Nuts like almonds, which I hear you carry in your purse.
I do.
And also even snacks like popcorn it's a higher fiber choice for snacks. So we try to encourage people to keep track as well of their fiber intake as well.
And this is to deal with the issue of constipation, so that we're not pushing so much
and
creating
prolapse and creating more incontinence.
Got it.
And more pressure on the bladder.
So let's get into these exercises. And I know you brought some models of pelvises, which are incredible. This is the female pelvis.
Yes, that's correct.
Wow.
Yes, yes. And I can show you the male pelvis here, which is much narrower. It's a narrower pelvic outlet.
Okay.
The female pelvis has a wider outlet because that is the birth outlet.
Okay, so the one I'm holding is the female.
The female, that's right. And the pelvic floor muscles are underneath. So they're literally the floor of the pelvis. And we're going to look at some exercises.
She's holding it this way. I was showing the camera completely upside down. So that's what we were looking at.
Yes, so
Me and Anatomy 101.
That's right. So these are the pelvic floor muscles here. Now the pelvic floor and the diaphragm work together. So we can actually exercise our pelvic floor by doing correct breathing and by sitting in the correct posture at the same time.
Okay.
So I'm going to show you a couple of exercises that work on that, and we can just start that right away.
Yeah.
Good. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by sitting correctly.
Okay, which I don't do,
and that
as
means
everyone knows.
having both feet on the floor and having your feet slightly apart. Okay, having the hips slightly apart, and we're going to sit evenly on our sits bones. We can just kind of wiggle back and forth to feel the sits bones, which are right underneath the pelvis. We're going to have a nice long spine, so lengthen up through the spine and tuck the chin in a little bit. Okay, we can put our hands on the abdomen, on the lower abdomen here, and take a nice breath in. As you breathe in, feel your abdominal muscles relaxing. As your diaphragm moves down, your pelvic floor also relaxes. As you breathe out again, the diaphragm moves up, and your pelvic floor will lift and contract naturally. So this is how we can exercise our pelvic floor to make the muscles more flexible, and then they will also be stronger as well.
Doing this breathing technique. How many times would we do this a day, and for how long?
Yes, so we can do this 3 times a day for approximately 1 to 5 minutes.
Okay.
And it's a very relaxing exercise that you can always do as part of, even with meditation as well.
Yeah.
And it can be very helpful to calm an overactive bladder, to help even with pelvic floor pain, and also to strengthen the muscles.
Excellent. We've got about 1.5 minutes. How about the next exercise?
Another great exercise is using the transverse abdominal muscle. This is a deep abdominal muscle, and studies have shown that when you contract your abdominal muscles, the pelvic floor will also contract. So what we do here is we just place our hands inside the front corners of the pelvis and then take a breath in. As you breathe out, we're going to pull the belly button in and just hold it there gently. So this muscle and your pelvic floor work together. And then we can just hold it there for 5 to 10 seconds while breathing. So we're breathing into the ribs, and then just gently let that muscle go.
That is awesome. And so people can come and see a pelvic floor physiotherapist to learn how to do these properly.
That's right.
And to not have this shame that we all have.
Exactly.
Let's talk to the people that know what they're talking about, that can help us. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us tonight. I know it's helped a lot of people.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you. When we come back, I'll share my final thoughts. Back in a moment. When Derick Fage stunned his followers on social media when he shared his hard truth publicly for the first time, he sparked something inside of me. He showed me that if he could share his story, then I could share mine too. And that was the beginning of me stepping into this whole new life where I no longer hide my shameful truths, but rather see them as my superpower. If we can all pull back the curtain in each of our lives, we're all living with things we feel shame around. But by sharing our stories, we discover that we're more similar than we are different. And by bringing our truths out into the light, we can know that we are not alone. If connection is the opposite of addiction, I feel the same way about any illness. Isolation and loneliness are common side effects for those living with incontinence, but it doesn't have to be this way. With millions of people living with it, and with so many amazing resources to support, there is no better time to reach out and get help. Thank you to my guests Derick Fage, Kathy Harley, and Jackie Pomeroy for working diligently to help those suffering know that there is hope and there is help. And thank you for being here. This episode marks the finale of Season 2 of Real Talk with Sarah, and I want to thank every single one of you who has watched and supported this show. I've loved bringing to light topics that may not be easy to talk about, but that need to be heard if we want to live with more compassion and a greater sense of connection to our human family. Until next time, I want you to remember one thing, that no matter where you are and no matter how it feels, you are never, ever alone. See you next time.